David Eby is going to be the next Premier of British Columbia. Before he was the leader of the NDP, he was the Minister of Housing, also the Attorney General, had some other jobs in government, but he really understands the housing file, I think better than most people at the provincial government level. So his housing plan is actually pretty comprehensive, and I thought it'd be worthwhile to just take you on a quick tour of it and offer some of my thoughts. When we look at the plan, it says immediate action on the housing emergency. I like the idea of immediate. Supply has always been the issue. If you listen to any of my podcasts back in 2017 and 2018, you'll remember that a lot of what I said and a lot of what I discovered was that supply is the issue, and we do need to just build more houses. We just have too many people here. So let's look what he said. He says he's going to work with Indigenous and local governments to build more housing to respond to the homelessness immediately. If you've spent any time going around Vancouver, you know this is just an absolutely massive problem. Not long ago, there was a fire in the downtown east side. There's not an inch of sidewalk left in parts of Hastings where people can sit. And so, yeah, we need to find some places for people to live. But I wonder if David Eby can do this in British Columbia without national help. The reason he would need national help is because if you just keep building houses and offering those houses to people who need them, people are going to come from everywhere. So there might be an unintended consequence here. If we build too much housing for people who need it, you might find people from other places coming here to fill up that housing. Think back, when Gregor Robertson was the mayor, he promised he'd get rid of homelessness in Vancouver. But here we are, well after the Robertson run of 10 years as mayor, we still have an enormous amount of homeless people in Vancouver. So I'm not sure that that problem can necessarily be solved at a provincial level, and it might require a federal housing plan. He says he's going to increase the Indigenous Housing Fund. Totally reasonable. Totally makes sense to me. I'd love to just see Canada deliver fresh water to every reserve possible. In a country as wealthy and as rich as ours, it's crazy that we can't deliver water to everybody, regardless of where they live, let alone housing. I'm hopeful, but I'm not terribly optimistic that we can solve the housing problems until we solve things like basic water delivery. The next section is called BC Builds, Real Middle Class Housing. This section I like, and he says that BC Builds will get to work building multifamily rental and purchase units in both urban and rural areas for a range of incomes. We haven't seen a massive amount of rental building in British Columbia since the 70s. And this goes all the way back to a tax policy that Trudeau Sr. changed around capital gains rollovers. It's a whole other conversation. Until we have some sort of rental renaissance, we won't be able to curb those rental prices to meet the demand of just regular people who want to live in the city and have a good job. So I like the idea that we can build that. He says he's going to partner with city governments, First Nations, nonprofits, and private partners. And of those three, governments, nonprofits, and First Nations, I think the only one who can deliver housing fast is private partners. We haven't seen a lot of nonprofits get a lot of housing together fairly quickly. First Nations who are building tend to do it in concert and in cooperation with a private partner, and we all know that government is terrible at building housing. So I like this idea, and I also like that he says they want to start offering rapid approvals, increased density, more land, and construction financing. And that construction financing piece could become more important than you realize as interest rates continue to rise. Developers will be more and more reluctant to take out large-scale loans to build product. But if the government is backing that with low-cost financing, making land available, and probably most importantly, speeding up the approvals process, this plan could really work, and I think it's a great idea. He wants to use public land to build housing. Governments do this all the time. They sell off assets that they own. They want to give up public land. At some point, we're going to run out of that public land, and it's concerning, but it's reasonable to move things forward and kind of catch up, because it's been a long time since we got some housing built. And he says he wants to lock in the low rates. I don't think he's going to be able to lock low rates in, but I think the government can back low rates going forward. Now, here's a policy that caught a lot of headlines. David Eby wants to bring in a BC house flipping tax. A flipping tax on sales of residential properties sold within 2 years. This is a tax on principal residency. And a couple elections ago, I remember the Conservatives were saying the federal Liberals want to tax your principal residency, and the Liberals were saying, no, this is all made up. This is all made up. Well, somebody does, and it sounds like it's David Eby and the provincial NDP. We already have flipping taxes on houses. If you buy a home in British Columbia and you renovate that home for the express purpose of selling or flipping, and you sell that home, the income you make on that home is taxed. And it's taxed as income. It's not taxed as a capital gain. If you hold the asset for a period of time, rent it, collect income from the rent, write that off against the expenses, and then sell it, that's a capital gain. But if you buy a home, renovate it, and sell it, that's taxed as income, because that's what that is. But if you do this with your principal residence and decide to move within 2 years, do you really want to be paying a tax? Think through COVID. I had a couple clients who moved twice in the course of those 2 years. Sometimes people buy a home, they have a baby, money, then they have to buy another home. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I'm opposed to this tax and I don't think it makes sense. Not the least of which is it already exists. Flipping is income, income is taxed. So I'm not sure that this goes to solving a lot, but it sounds really good and it's probably the policy in here that got the most amount of headlines. Acquire and secure rental housing for the long term. I like the idea of securing and creating rental housing. I'm not sure I like the idea of government being involved in the ownership of that rental housing. Government is not good at owning and running and managing things efficiently, but there's some good ideas in here. He wants a $500 million capital fund to jumpstart rental housing acquisition so that nonprofits can afford to purchase affordable rental buildings listed for sale to protect renters living there without displacement. Well, affordable living has a lot of connotations in terms of it. In this case, I think what David Eby and the NDP are getting at is they want rental restricted buildings that might be sold to be bought up by other funds. And that kind of already happens. We don't have a lot of these. I don't think this is the government getting into the private rental market and buying up apartment buildings for middle-class people, which is what I think most people, the big middle in British Columbia, I think what most people care about is trying to find affordable for them rental housing. A one-bedroom that's not $2,000 a month. A three-bedroom that's not $3,500 a month. And I don't think that falls under this definition of affordable housing. Here we're talking income-restricted, social assistance kind of housing. They want to bring in a right of first refusal law that stops affordable rentals being bought by big corporations. I don't see a lot of this happening, but for those of you in Vancouver, you'll know about the Little Mountain development between Queen Elizabeth Park and Main. That was bought up by a developer. It used to be kind of some social type housing, and all of that was torn down. The site has sat empty for 10 years. The province sold it out. It was a whole scandal. So it's reasonable to come up with a policy like this to prevent that from happening again. They want to protect tenants from rent increase when the building's purchased. That law already exists. There's nothing new here. If someone purchases a building, and I know this because I own an apartment building, I can't just go raise the rent on the tenants. That's not an option. I'm limited to whatever the province tells me I can do, even if I just happen to buy the building. And finally, the last section of this policy is really, really good. And this section is going to make the biggest difference for the most amount of people. Changing the game. 1, removing strata restrictions on rentals. Get this, right now, there are buildings in Vancouver where you are not allowed to rent your unit if you don't live in it. Unless you're renting to your parents or your kids, you can always go kind of up or down the family line. So there's buildings in Vancouver where you can't rent. At the same time, you are responsible for paying the vacancy and speculation tax and the Vancouver vacant housing tax if you don't live in that home. So you're not allowed to rent it. You might not be able to live in it. And if you can't live in it, say you're in a senior care facility, you've gone on sabbatical for a year, traveling the world, you got a job placement somewhere else for a year, you have to pay tax on a home that you can't live in, that you can't rent. And so you're forced to sell that home into whatever market you find yourself in. It's one of those areas where government doesn't do a great job of talking to each other. And so removing the strata restriction on buildings, I think would go a long way to freeing people up so that everyone could rent no matter where they lived. Second, he wants to legalize secondary suites everywhere in the province. I don't know the mechanism of how he's going to do this, but I like this idea. I like the idea of the provincial government coming in hard against the civic governments saying, hey, you have a role in zoning and allowing buildings to be made, and we need more housing. So we're gonna make it easier for people to put a secondary suite in their home. Vancouver's a great example. There's so many people in Vancouver who have secondary suites in their home that are unauthorized. The city of Vancouver will take money from you for a permit to give you a rental permit on your suite, even though your suite is an unauthorized suite and your zoning might not allow it or your house might not allow it. We need more suites in homes. We need more housing for people. And this policy at a provincial top-down level into neighborhoods and into cities across the province is a great idea. And finally, he talks about adding density into urban centers. And I quote from the policy here: home builders in major urban centers will be allowed to replace single-family homes with up to 3 units. Now in Vancouver, we kind of already have that, right? You can build a house, a laneway, and a suite on most lots, or you can build a duplex on most lots. What'll be interesting to see is if the provincial government can override the Vancouver Charter and have people building a duplex and a coach house, because then you've got 3 fully functioning homes and you don't have that subsidiary suite in the basement. You could have 3 3-bedrooms or 2 3-bedroom half duplexes and another 2-bedroom on the backside of a property. That would go a long way to improving affordability in the medium and long term. Overall, I think the policies here are pretty good. Some of them are more workable than others. Some of them are just here for politics, and they make a lot of sense. They make really good headlines, but at the end of the day, they're not going to do anything to make your rent go down until we have some sort of rental renaissance. If anybody in this province at the provincial level is qualified to come up with housing policies to move forward on this issue, it's David Eby. I've interviewed him in the past. I'm going to put a link in this video as well to my interview with him back in 2017, and you can listen to what he had to say about housing then. He's a guy who understands these policies. I have a lot of respect for him, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he does on the housing file as our premier. What do you think of David Eby becoming our next premier? Be sure to leave your comments below, click to subscribe, like, and share with your friends.